Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to St Matthew's Church. It's very good to see you here tonight. I'm Richard Coombs. I'm the rector, the pastor of this church. And it is a real joy to be partnering with God First Church tonight. I think this is the first event we've done together. Howard and I have talked for a number of years about how we must do more things together. We pray together regularly, so we're good friends, we're brothers in Christ, co-pastors here in town, and it's just great to be doing this. If you need to get out quickly, there are two exits. There's one here where it says fire exit, and there's one at the back the way that you came in. And if you need the toilets, the door over there will take you to two toilets, or right at the back where we're having coffee, there are toilets there as well. Do feel free to use those at any time during the evening. Now, this is the first time we have hosted Rethink here. It is a wonderful initiative where we have the opportunity to examine some really pressing contemporary issues with the help of experts who know a lot more about these issues than we do. It's an opportunity for us as Christians to examine these issues, but it's also an opportunity for us to invite friends. And if you are here as a friend of a Christian, then you're really welcome, and we really hope that you'll enjoy this evening. I'm going to hand over to Howard now, who is going to introduce Daniel, and I think that mic should be working. I think it should be.
Yeah, brilliant. Really great to see you here. Just to underline what Richard said, it is great to partner together. And we know that the people in the room here might be just a whole spectrum of approaches and worldviews. And so although we're in a church building, don't expect a preach. This is not the word I think is a polemic. We're not trying to force a view on you, but we are hopefully tackling a big issue with Daniel. It's great to have Daniel with us. And to be able to come at that with a different perspective. It will have some Christian worldview content and stuff like that, but we just want to engage you in the topic and suggest, is there perhaps a different way to look at this? And this is what Rethink is about. It's about, so let's rethink some of the things, because the messaging we get out in culture often is very binary, but actually we need a wider perspective, and Daniel's an expert in his field, and he's able to bring a wider perspective. So you might have come here because you think, man, this is me in my situation. You might have come here because you know somebody like that, or you might just come here because you're interested. So wherever you are, just invite you to engage in that. And when Richard leads us in question and answer afterwards, there are no questions that are off limits. Hope you'll be nice with your questions, but yeah, there's no questions that are off limits. You know, it's a chance to explore this topic in a way together. So let's put our hands together and welcome Daniel Moore. Daniel's a consultant psychiatrist, and actually you know a lot more about yourself, so why don't you tell us about yourself? You have permission in this moment to just tell us about yourself, and the more intelligent you make yourself look at this point, the more they'll trust you. So okay. you can really big yourself up without getting the kind of sense of people are saying that you're too proud or whatever. But so just tell us about yourself, and then why don't you talk us through the meeting crisis? Brilliant.
I'll start you with my GCSE results. No, I better not start there. Yeah. My name is Daniel. It's great to be here this evening. And yes, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. For those of you who get confused with these different professionals with the word psych at the beginning, a psychiatrist is the medical version of the psych world. So there's psychologists that do talking therapies. Psychiatrists do medicating, diagnosing, and caring for mental illnesses. And I work in the psychosis service for Oxfordshire. Psychosis is madness. It's where people perhaps have schizophrenia or bipolar, and that's a real interest of mine, a passion of mine to care for people with those conditions. And I also research with the Oxford University Department of Psychiatry, and we do lots of interesting research all the way from new medications all the way through to virtual reality studies, looking at how to sort of undermine people's paranoid delusions by putting them in certain situations. So lots of cool stuff that I'll have to make sure I don't talk too much about. So that's me, and yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm talking to you this evening about meaning. I would say this picture was taken about 15 years ago. I did give a later photo to Howard, but it didn't look professional enough. So apologies for the slightly more sort of scruffy Daniel Morn that's a bit older. So yes, the meaning crisis. Before I start, I just want to give a big caveat here, okay? I'm a psychiatrist. I'm talking about sort of psychological, sort of mental healthy stuff. But this is not a talk aimed at people with mental health problems, okay? As I've said here, the causes of mental illness are complex and varied, often genetic in origin, okay? And what I'm here to talk about today is not the difficulties that people experience as a result of mental illness, but I want to talk to everyone about the struggle that we all have with finding our meaning, okay? So I'm going to begin with some bit of data for you, just to kind of paint the picture. And I'm sure you know already, but life is very stressful, isn't it? So I've got some stats here. 1 in 14 adults feel stressed every day. That's quite a lot of people here. 74% of people in the past year felt totally overwhelmed with stress. I've got some stats about what stresses us out. So we've got housing being a big one. A third of 18 to 24-year-olds, house prices are going up, aren't they? We've got debt, 1 in 5, 22%. Friends or relatives or even yourself with a health condition causing stress. How about this last one? What do you think of this last one? 12% feeling the need to respond to messages instantly. That's me. How about these next ones? 36% of women and 23% of men, body image. Increasing problem with Gen Z and teenagers and social media, I think. 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds stressed by a comparison to others. And 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds and 40% of that next one up, pressure to succeed. I think these 3 causes of stress are interesting. Interesting because perhaps they're not necessary, but interesting also perhaps because they speak into where people might find meaning. And here we have some really perhaps scary stats in a way. So 1 in 5 people have suicidal thoughts in a lifetime. 1 in 14 self-harm. And 1 in 15 attempt suicide. You surprised by that? It's quite a lot, isn't it? Now, of course, lots of these people might have mental health problems, mental illness, but lots of them don't too. And we have to see the fact that perhaps there's a meaning crisis when we see that people are turning to this in their lives. So we get to a deep question. Who am I, and how do I fit into the world around me? Now that's a difficult enough question, isn't it, for any one of us? But when we're really stressed, when the turbulence of life hits you in the face, this question gets more real. It gets really in your face. What's life about? What am I doing? Why do I have to cope with this stress? Why bother? There was this chap called Viktor Frankl. Some of you might have heard of him. He was an Auschwitz survivor and a psychiatrist. And he developed this therapy called logotherapy, meaning therapy. And he had this phrase that there is a vacuum of meaning in society today. And I have to say, in my clinical practice, sadly, it's often the case. People do struggle for meaning. And I think perhaps some of you might, at times of stress, have asked yourself that question too. So then we have Nietzsche. You'll have heard of Nietzsche, who has this famous quote, "Those who have a why can bear with almost any how." What's that why? What's that why? That's the meaning. What's my meaning? If you have a reason, then you can cope with the stress. If you've got an understanding of perhaps what you're about, then stresses perhaps are put into their context and seen in good proportion. And here we're talking about existential matters, folks, and there is an existential triad here: identity, meaning, and purpose. And this is a sort of critical bit of content for the rest of my talk. So, identity is how we understand ourselves. Who am I? Out of identity flows meaning. So if I know who I am, then I will find certain things meaningful, and I will find meaning in different activities and in what I do and what, these things. And out of meaning flows purpose. So here's an example. I'm a dad, so I might have a bit of an identity as a provider, right? So meaning for me, I get some meaning from activities that might bring in the cash. So I've got a purpose in getting a job. So you can see those three flowing together. Perhaps your identity is not in that particular vein, and you've got an identity as an adventurer. So you find meaning, deep meaning in going travelling, and you find it really meaningful to go and explore new things. So your purpose is to go out and go to these new places. Maybe some of you have an identity as a bit of an outsider. You're sitting there here, I don't belong. Look at all these different people. They look different to me. So your meaning you might be looking for meaning in just feeling that sense of being included. That sense of, actually, maybe somebody wants me here. That's so meaningful to me when somebody says, welcome. So your purpose then is to find belonging. So that's a bit of a deeper one there. So you can see how these three factors hang together, the existential triad: identity, meaning, and purpose. And I want to talk a bit more about identity, because this is where meaning comes from, okay? And there is a bit of an identity confusion happening at the moment in our society, I believe. There are many different ways to view your identity, okay? Just like you can look at something really complex and people can see different things in it, you can kind of look at that identity in that way. So there are extrinsic or external ways of looking at your identity, okay? So you might say, it's to do with your job, or it's to do with where you live, or your nationality, or your gender, or your social class. So these are kind of external things that people can see, and that might form your identity, or one way of looking at identity. It might be what you do. How many of you have, meet people and say, "Oh, hi, I'm Daniel, nice to meet you. What do you do?" It's a way we place people in their identity, right? Or perhaps their interests. That's what you do. How about experientially, the inner eye, that inner monologue that goes through and goes, what am I doing here? Or, I like that. Or the way you talk to yourself. Is that you? Is that your identity? How about morals, values, worldview, or your faith? Or how about even relationships? These are all different ways that we can view our identity. And I'm going to argue that some ways are limiting, and we need to be careful about how we look at our identity. And I think there's a current identity dogma. And this is a work by Charles Taylor, if any of you have heard of him. He's a philosopher from America. And he has this theory that the modern social milieu, the modern social way of understanding oneself, he calls it the social imaginary, is that people think they're being authentically themselves when they live out their emotional preferences. So in order to deeply understand oneself and why you feel as you do, you need to understand yourself. You need to understand why you feel as you do, if that makes sense. And of course, Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous existentialist, said, "We are our thoughts and feelings and values, the totality of our experience." I'm just going to walk you through some little quotes of a bit more data and some quotes. So 95% of teens said having a fulfilling job is very important. 80% said helping others is very important. But getting married, having children is much less important. So there's this sense that it's what you do that might be getting a bit more important, rather than perhaps some of the ties that you might have with your community. So experiences, hobbies, likes and dislikes, and social circle are really crucial to defining identity these days. I've got a quote here: "What I choose to enjoy and pursue plays a lot more heavily on my life than where I'm from or my heritage." Identity is something that can change, like politics, and that's a belief shared by a lot of my generation. We're heading here towards an experiential form of identity, where people think it's the inner I that is who they are. And in a sense, you know, if you define yourself experientially, as a psychiatrist, you can be sort of treated as the high priest to the modern religion of experience, because, you know, I've got the meds that can make you feel happy, right? So, and perhaps I understand why people feel sad. So perhaps, you know, there's this sort of sense of psychiatrists sort of being able to really get people and see people. That's not quite right. We categorize mental illness. But you can kind of get into that, pushed into that position a little bit, which I find interesting. So there are lots of different ways to look at identity. And perhaps experientially is the leading sort of way these days. We're moving away from, you know, if you had asked people 100 years ago, they would have said, well, I'm a builder and I live in Devon, and that's who I am. You know? Whereas actually much more now it's about what goes on up here that people think that's their identity. And as I said before, we get meaning from our identity. But I say every person is tempted to ground their identity in 3 lies. I am what I have, I am what I do, and I am what other people say or think of me. That's Henry Nouwen, who's a Catholic monk and died 30 years ago. I would add one more to this, is that I am my experience. I wonder how many of you are challenged a bit by that. I certainly am. So, if identity is based on experiential or emotional grounds, then our meaning is to gratify our emotional needs. So if I'm somebody who, you know, wants, you know, understand that I like this and I dislike that and I want to be there and I and then so therefore the meaning is found in finding that experience. People are looking for experiences. And the trouble is with the sense of ultimate meaning coming into being experiential. We're all yearning for that peace. We're looking for that desert island. We're waiting for that moment of calm. We're finding meaning in just a sense of escapism. Very little meaning is found in suffering. This paradigm doesn't work. Why? Because emotions are up and down all the time. You can never experience complete calm for long periods. I can tell you that as a psychiatrist. People are up, they're down, people struggle with sadness all the time. Anxiety is here with us every day. If you're looking for experience as your meaning, you'll never find it. Interestingly, I'll tell you where this kind of, in a way, this kind of emperor's new clothes, this kind of illusion of how we should look at our identity has come from. The godfathers of sort of modern psychological thinking, humanistic psychology, Carl Rogers and Maslow, they were brilliant in the way that they understood that people who are depressed and people who are really anxious needed to really go on a journey inside themselves to understand, why is it that I'm depressed? Maybe I'm depressed because I don't accept myself and my mum was critical of me and I got bullied at school and I never really realised that. But actually I've gone on a journey inside and I've found the reason why I'm actually very clinically depressed, or even just perhaps mildly clinically depressed, but there's a problem there. And that journey inward helps. It's a clinical tool which helps. Unfortunately, Rogers and Maslow then went on to say that this idea of going on an inward journey was an eternal truth for mankind that we should all aspire to. This doesn't work. It doesn't work morally. It doesn't work ethically. You can't say to everyone in the street, just go and do what you really want to do. It doesn't work. It falls apart, if that makes sense. It works if somebody's depressed and they find out that they've got an unresolved issue with their mum. Then they need to go and speak to their mum. And they've elevated a clinical tool up to trying to understand humanity. This is where it's come from, guys. It's a bit like saying, diabetics need insulin, so let's all take insulin, and that's the reason for life. It doesn't work. Jim Carrey, big fan of his. I hope everyone could get rich and famous and will have everything they ever dreamed of, so they will know that it's not the answer. Yeah, that's kind of a guy from the top saying, this doesn't work, right? So, to summarise where we've got to so far, you can look at identity in lots of different ways. But it's important to look at your identity in the right way, because if you don't look at it in the right way, actually you're looking for meaning in wrong places. And actually, particularly if you accept the current dogma of who I am is my inner I and my experience, you're not going to find meaning because you can't maintain that. And you'll be looking for that experience, and that didn't work. Looking for that relationship, that didn't fit. Looking for that job, not satisfied. So we struggle to find meaning. So the question comes, how should we view our identity, right? And therein, perhaps look for meaning in good places. And this is what takes me to the next bit of my talk, which is about stories. I worked in a narrative-based therapy clinic several years ago. I'll tell you a bit about it because it's quite an interesting setup. I worked with another therapist, so there were two therapists, and we worked with couples or families. And we sat down chatting with them in the room, finding out what was going on, set them a couple of questions, and then we used to leave the room and go behind a sort of a mirror that we could see through, but they just saw a mirror. Yeah, cheeky. And then we used to watch them. And what we were trying to find out was the family narrative, or the narrative of the couple. So what was the story the family lived? What was the story of the couple? And then we used to have to go back in the room, and this was the awkward bit, that the family or the couple would then watch me and the therapist talk to each other about our observations. So you always felt a bit treading on eggshells there, but it was quite powerful stuff. It was really intense. We used to see that actually sometimes stories get stuck. Stories can get waylaid. I remember this one family that the father got depressed, and the family kind of fell apart. And we found out that he was quite a dominating dad and quite a dominating husband. And we found out the story of the family was kind of all about making the dad happy. But when he got clinically depressed, they couldn't make him happy anymore. And they didn't know what to do, so they all started falling out and getting really angry and frustrated. And naming that story of the family was quite a powerful thing. And actually, perhaps it shouldn't have been their story, because no story of a family should be all about one person, right? And I think the dad was quite pleased, because I think he felt a big pressure as well to be that performing, happy person. So naming that story was quite freeing, shall we say. But the thing is, we all tell ourselves stories. Next slide. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about the others and the world around us. We get meaning from the stories we tell ourselves. Stories are another way in to understanding your identity. We are often unaware of these stories, just like that family. We actually inhabit multiple plot lines. You might have some stories that come into play at particular times. Stories can get given to us by family. They can get given to us by school. They can be given to us by adverse experiences like bullying. So stories are where I'm going to go and talk about a bit more. And the thing is, the brain is a storytelling machine. Whether you like it or not, folks, you see stories everywhere. Why I've put about the real Prince Harry. Is he even a prince anymore? Is he a prince or just a duke? Or whatever he is, I don't know. Why don't famous people like meeting Joe Public? It's because Joe Public has developed a story about that famous person and thinks they know that famous person. And the famous person goes, "You don't know me." And it's really annoying that everyone thinks they know me and they don't. And they're projecting stories on me all over the place. We tell stories about people. We create stories about ourselves on social media. The photos we put up, we're telling stories. We read stories into other people's lives. Stories hold power. I'll tell you a little story. There was a man who was on the tube on the way home from work. And he'd always thought, he's had a bit of a story going on. Nobody notices me. Nobody really cares about me. And it was reasonably late in the evening, and the tube was quite quiet. And then suddenly a woman came on with 6 kids. And the woman put the bags down and just sat down and just looked at the floor. While the 6 kids proceeded to jump around the carriage. One stepped over him and were being very loud and noisy and disruptive. And he was there thinking, here we go again. Nobody cares about me. Nobody notices me. He got up, he spoke to that woman, he said, "Excuse me, madam, can you please control your children? And she looked up at him and said, I'm so sorry. We've just come back from their dad's funeral, and I just can't cope with telling them off. It's just beyond me. That story is one of a dramatic paradigm shift. That guy was immersed in his story, but how wrong that story was for that situation. His story got in the way of him seeing the truth of the situation. His story made him act in an inappropriate way to a grieving woman, perhaps. Disney. Guilty. Guilty why? Guilty for giving us false conceptions of love. I don't know how many of you ever thought you might live happily ever after, or whether there might be nice plinky-plonky music playing when you suddenly, on first seeing somebody, know that they're going to be the person you spend the rest of your life with. I did. I think it was disco music, actually, for me. No, I don't know. Disney give us stories. We live inside Disney. How terrible. Or maybe how lovely. We think about ourselves in stories. Here's the critical bit. We interpret events around us by inserting them into our existing plot lines. Two men. One a Dora Scott. The other one a plucky Englishman. They both lose their job. The Dora Scott, he's got a story, and he thinks, I'm a failure. I'm a failure again. This has proven it. Nail in the coffin. I'm a failure. Guaranteed. No doubt about it now. The plucky Englishman goes, oh, it's just another chance to prove I can get up off the floor and get another job. That's his story. Bit tongue-in-cheek. The same event can hold very different meanings because of the stories that we tell ourselves. So stories shape our identity, and we need to be careful of them. I went to Kenya this summer to see my wife's brother and his family, with my family. The plane was cancelled, and I'll just be vulnerable and open with you guys. One of my difficult stories is I'm not a control freak, but I do like it when things are kind of a bit in control. And the plane cancelled, and it was a nightmare. My wife, who's usually, if I can be honest, a little bit more of a stressy one of the two, her story was of, we are going to overcome. We will overcome. So I went to pieces, and she actually saw it as an adventure, and she was showing the kids, no, we can do this. Don't you worry, kids. Moment of shame for Daddy Morn there. Here are some healthy stories. I'm not perfect, but I know nobody else is either. My friends or family will be there for me even if I mess up. I know I try, but even if I fail, it's the trying that counts. There's some pretty healthy stories. Here's some unhealthy stories, or perhaps harmful stories. See if any of these resonate with you guys. I must always be successful. Nobody will ever like me because I'm a failure. I must always play safe and never take risks. I must work hard to be liked by everyone. If everyone likes me, then I'm okay. I need to prove myself before I'm accepted by anyone. I must only ever trust myself. All relationships would always break down, no matter what I do. These are harmful because they might hold partial truth. It's nice if some people like you some of the time. But some of them are just outright lies. They're predictors of poor mental well-being. Some of them are predictors of poor mental health as well. Critically for this evening, stories like this fail to hold meaning. I must always be successful. Ever more successful? Success after success? I must always be successful story to an athlete that has an injury. Where do they get their meaning from? Nobody will ever like me because I'm a failure. Who's defining failure? I must always play safe and never take risks. To live and to love is risk. It'll be struggle to find meaning with a story like that. A couple of others. How about, if everyone likes me, then I'm okay. And the next two, I need to prove myself. I must only ever trust myself. I must only ever trust myself. Defining your identity based on others' views, that's precarious. I think you can kind of divide some of these stories into two categories. You can you can kind of separate some out to be striving stories, like really, I'm striving, I'm going for something. I must always be successful. I've got to strive. I've got to strive. I've got to keep going. I've got to earn everyone's respect. I've got to make everyone like me. They're striving narratives. But it's like an addiction that you can't quench. Some of them are suffocating stories. Nobody will ever like me because I'm a failure. That's going to suffocate the meaning out of everything you do. There are some here that are relativistic. So relativistic stories are stories that compare yourself to others. So I must be successful. Successful according to whom? Right? Relativistic narratives are meaningless. I'll give you two examples. Grew up in South Wales. Remember going down Big Pit, hearing the plight of the miners. Dreadful, awful, what huge swathes of South Wales have to go through in those mines. You can guarantee in those mines there would have been a lowly miner, a lowly person who had a worse job. And then you had the foreman miner. He had an absolutely terrible job, but it was slightly better than the other one. So his narrative is going, well, aren't I a success? Aren't I brilliant? But looking from our perspective, you think, well, they're both losers, aren't they? Do you see what I mean? I mean, not wanting to put tongue in cheek for the miners, it was a terrible life, but you can see how the success-oriented narrative gets a bit farcical, right? Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Two people on yachts. There's quite an interesting book by Alain de Botton called Status Anxiety. And he's proven, he showed with evidence that the more successful you get, the worse your status anxiety. So that's anxiety about your status. The worse your anxiety status gets. So you know what? If you're there comparing your Ford Fiesta or Focus to that nice Renault Megane over there, you can guarantee that there's a guy with a 40-metre-foot yacht that's looking with sickening envy at a 60-foot yacht, going, I just want that. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. Success suffocates too. You might be thinking, how on earth do we develop these stories? Some of them are a bit bonkers. Why have I ended up with these stories? We have what's called cognitive errors. These are ways of thinking that we all have a habit of doing that can kind of reinforce and maintain stories. So black and white thinking. If you see a couple broken up, I mean, this might be the case sometimes, but your relationship that break up, they're always like, oh, they were terrible. I was like, hang on, last week you loved them, didn't you? Or you go for your exam. If I pass this exam, I will be a winner. But if I fail, my life will be over. black and white thinking. Overgeneralization. You get lots of feedback, you get one bit of critical feedback, and that's the only thing you listen to. You go to a wedding, everyone's friendly, but somebody's horrible, and that's the only thing you can think about. And that's what that plays into your story. Nobody likes me. Well, they didn't like me. Well, everyone else did. No, just can't hear it. You just don't hear it. You tune it out, because a story is not your story. Jumping to conclusions. Belief that you know what another person is thinking. So you walk past somebody, they don't look at you and they don't smile. You think, oh, they don't like me. Or maybe they disagree with you in a meeting. Oh, they must hate my guts, they just disagree with me. You've just jumped to that conclusion. Yeah? So these are ways that stories get developed and maintained. Emotional reasoning. The acceptance of your emotion as fact. Well, I walked into the room and I felt really anxious, and I just felt like people just didn't like me. Or I felt like I just didn't fit in. And then labelling, that's a bit like prejudice, but you kind of label situations or you label people. You know, they're old and grumpy. I don't like work. And you label it, and you're kind of just generalising it. And you put a label on it, and you don't like thinking more about it. Cognitive errors, ways of thinking, maintain stories. Often false stories. So, finding your story. How am I doing for time, by the way? Don't know. Okay, fine. Are you fine? Okay. How do you find your story, guys? Track, trace and tackle. We're in an Anglican building, so we've got some alliteration going on here. 3 points. Do I get some points for that? Thank you. Thanks. That's right. Success. That's right. Yeah, I fit in now. So track. Pay attention to your thoughts. Pay attention to your feelings. Pay attention at pinch points. That's more alliteration, actually. I didn't intend that. So anyway, when you're struggling, when you're up against it, when you've got that exam, when you've got that interview, when your relationship's on the rocks, where do you go? What's your emotion saying? What are you thinking about? Those are good moments to find your story. So you track, being aware of what you think and how you behave, and you trace. There's this thing called the 5 whys. So why am I feeling like that? I'm feeling like this. Well, I'm feeling like that because of that. Well, why that? And you're trying to dig a tunnel down to the story. And then you address this story. Let me give you an example. Can you read that? I must pass this exam. Why? Well, if I fail my exams, I'll upset my parents. I'll look bad. I won't get that job that I've set my heart on. Well, why? Well, if I upset my parents, they won't love me. Oh, hang on. Oh, is that a story? If I look bad, I'll lose my status with my friends. Oh, that's a story. If I don't get that job, I won't have the life I've planned. Story of control, maybe? Other ways of looking for your story. Liken your life to a book. Look for fictional pages. We don't only tell ourselves lies, but we also turn facts into fiction. Who's ever been in an argument where you go, well, I didn't say that. Yeah, you did say that. No, I did. Oh, I can't remember saying it. We always remember things differently, right? We remember past events very differently. Sometimes it's good to look for those. Look for imbalanced pages. We might not tell ourselves that straight out lies, but more emphasis on some pages than others. Maybe those exams you didn't do so well in. Maybe those relationships that broke down. Maybe that time you were told off in work. Those are the imbalanced pages. Look for unopened pages, some events we just can't remember. I mean, I see people who literally cannot remember some traumas that they've experienced. And that has to be handled very, very carefully. But we all do this to varying extents. We forget important bits because they don't fit our narrative. Look for well-worn pages. What's that memory you keep going back to? Is it a failure? Maybe it's that time that, you were, got top of the year, or, that award, and and that's the thing you keep thinking back to. Why is that so important to you? What's going on? And look for duplicate pages. Are there any repeating patterns? Is the same ways relationships break down, the same type of arguments in your relationships? These might help you find your stories. You have multiple plot lines. Some of them will be lies. Some of them will be truths. Some of them will be partial truths. And we've got to be careful that we're not living out stories that are lies or partial truths. Because when we look for meaning, it's hard to find meaning when you understand your identity as something which is just not true, it's just not right. But we all do this to varying extents. So stories create meaning in our lives. If we can find and understand the stories we're living inside, we can develop agency. That is the ability to manipulate or control or decide about what's meaningful to us. You look at these people who are, let's all face it, on a bit of a losing battle with the plastic surgery, facelift, boob job. It's like we all grow old, isn't it? And we need to think about that. There's meaning perhaps in how we look that just becomes quite addictive and overly controlling of their lives. But it's hard, it's really hard not to get trapped inside relativistic stories. It's really hard not to be caught up in this experiential sort of narrative about life. We all want to have that perfect, peaceful home. And I guess, this is the bit where I say that I'm a Christian, and I believe I've been given a story, actually. I don't think, whilst I have come up with all of my plot lines and all of my stories, that anything could mean more to me than the story that's been given to me by God. So there's a chap called Paul who wrote a letter to the church in Ephesus in the first century in Asia Minor, and this is a verse from that letter, and this is the great story that God gives us. God chose us before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in His sight. In love, He predestined, He planned for us to have adoption through Jesus Christ in accordance with His pleasure and will, to the praise of His glorious name, which He has freely given us in the one He loves. I've highlighted 3 bits there. God chose us. God chose you. He intended you for adoption. He didn't just choose you for a job. He chose you to be His child. And He gives this to us freely. The thing about finding stories, the thing about finding meaning, is it's hard work. You feel you need to keep doing stuff to find it. And it's utterly freeing being given a story. The thing about God's story is it's not just a big story that we have to invest in and that's it. God comes down and actually redeems and sets free some of our distorted stories that we live. So you think you can't be loved? God's story says he loves you and he always will. He intended you. You think you need to earn trust? God trusts you with life and choice every day. You think you need to be successful, but God in creating you has already made you unique and wonderful. You cannot be more or less successful, whatever you do. You think you're a failure. You're right, you are. We all are. And that's why he sent Jesus. And that's why we can rest, knowing, because of what Jesus did on the cross, we know that we can be fully accepted by God. We can actually redeem our narratives. We can leave behind the lies and the stories that are lies because we know we're loved. So that storyline saying, I can't be loved, well, we can leave that. But he can also redeem stories as well. And we can invest in his big story that I believe has eternal meaning. So, where do I find meaning? I've had to challenge my stories, I tell you, and I keep on having to challenge my stories. One story that I've really had to challenge is my success-oriented narrative, I think. I've always been an ambitious person. I did reasonably well in school, got into medical school, and I always wanted to push myself. And I thought I was doing pretty well. And then after second year of medical school, I had a nasty accident, and I paralysed my right arm. And it still doesn't work. And I had to really reevaluate at that point in my life, I was 20, what was meaningful. I believe God was there, and by his grace, he gave me a real sense that it wasn't my successes that were important. It didn't mean a thing that I'd got into medical school or done quite well at school or people kind of liked me. I wasn't popular or whatever. That wasn't important. And I got a real sense that actually it was how I was serving and caring and loving others. Had I been a good son to my parents? Not very. Had I been a good older brother and younger brother? I've been all right. Had I been a good friend? I've been okay most of the time. I felt quite inadequate, to be honest, when I got challenged by that story. So I moved from a kind of relativistic, so comparing myself, how am I doing compared to others kind of story, to a relational story. And I've put a tree there because it's kind of how I look at my identity a bit. I think who I am is best understood in how I am in relationships, and that's quite a really very Christian way of looking at things, is that we view our identity in relational terms. We are a child of God, but actually our job here is to care for others. And if we think of a tree, we've got the roots. Now I'd say the roots are what goes on up here. So we need to get the roots right. We need to think carefully. We need to manage our mind. We need to manage our emotions. We need to understand who we can trust. We need to understand how to behave. But they're only the roots. Because actually the tree is all about the relationships. Get the roots right, and that tree will be a beautiful tree. But people who see their meaning as experiential, they get trapped in the roots because they think all they are is up here. They're only seeing half of the tree, and it's the bit of the tree that nobody else can see. So my identity is, yes, it's seen relationally through my relationship to God. And I would say that I'm still ambitious, but my ambition is for the day. It's not for some big glory. My ambition is for the day. And what I mean by that is to live each day in good relationship with God, to be a person of integrity, and to feel like I don't succeed all the time or lots of the time. But actually to have success for me would be, how have I treated people in the day? Have I spotted that person who just needed that something? And I took out my way. And if I feel like I've done that, then that for me is success. I think God's redeemed that narrative for me. I need to keep pulling it back into the day. I'm a terrible planner. I guess the key here is that my success, though, is no longer contingent on, my story and my meaning is no longer contingent on my success. Meaning becomes contingent on the story, or based on, or reliant upon. My meaning is reliant upon the story that's been given to me. Doesn't matter what I do, I can embrace that story. So, this is the last slide. We need to investigate our stories. You will be living stories that are lies. I live stories that are lies. It's not just you guys. I do it still. We live inside understandings of who we are that blur the truths of the experiences that we have each day. They twist and distort. They help us. They make us forget things or not hear things properly. They make us see people in wrong ways. So we need to investigate and understand the stories that we live in. And once you've found that story, the meaning just flows out of that. And I think, for me, whilst I've still got lots of different plot lines going on, my overarching story is that of a God who intended me, he created me. But he looks at me and goes, you haven't got things quite right, Daniel, but I've done something for you. I've given up my son so that you can be in free relationship with me and trusting relationship with me. You can rely on me. And I think that if we let perhaps our own stories get more important than God's big story for us, then things can come a cropper. We've got to be careful. So when you've got that difficult exam, when you've got that interview, that's okay as long as we've got this big storyline going on, that no matter what you do, you're loved. So it's about having a sense of being given a story, a freeing story, a story that allows you to see the world, I think, in crystal clarity. Thank you.
I've muted myself, that's why. Entirely my fault. Daniel, thank you very, very much indeed for an incredibly stimulating talk. I think we might just have 5 minutes just to turn to our neighbour, talk about what you thought of the talk, whether you've got any questions that's come into your mind. And if you'd like to ask something, then there'll be an opportunity to do so. We've got about just a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes to do that. Turn to your neighbour, think of a question which might be helpful to ask out loud. Just to stress that Daniel's not here in a clinical capacity, so he's not going to answer specific cases, but I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions of a more general nature. So just 5 minutes to chat to your neighbour. So somebody's going to come round with a radio mic, I think. Lollipop mic. Has somebody got that? Yes, Janet has. But just to kick us off, because I'm in charge, I'm going to ask the first question. So my question, Daniel, is that many people have stories going around in their heads which they don't like, which they tell themselves, they're very intrusive, and they find them very hard to get rid of. Is there a way to get rid of a negative, dysfunctional story?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Richard. That's really helpful. Yeah, really good point. And I didn't perhaps go into this as much as I should. There is an acceptance these days that it is sometimes impossible to get rid of some of those critical inner thoughts or those really core beliefs of I'm a failure. They don't just disappear. And it is, they continue to sort of cause distress, no matter how much CBT you might do, or how much you try and tackle them. And actually, the theory goes, and sort of this fourth wave of therapies, things like acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness and things like this, that actually it's the perspective you have towards those stories that is critical. And so, you might have that, oh, I'm a failure. But let's try and get some perspective on that and look at it and accept that it's there, acknowledge that it's there, but actually I'm not going to let it control me. And I think one of the great things about God's story is it gives you that real perspective to look at those other narratives and go, I know you're there, but I know you're not right. I know God loves me. I know there's always going to be a little bit that goes, you're unlovable, you're unlovable. But I can stand here, trusting God, and looking at that and going, I know you're there, but I'm going to look this way. And that kind of is in line with some of these modern theories. Mindfulness, you focus on the body and the here and now to try and cope with it. So there is that acceptance that sometimes they don't go away.
Daniel. Question over here.
How do you, identify what a harmful story is versus a good story? I'm kind of asking because one of the questions for you.
Yeah.
One of the harmful stories was, don't take risks because the world is a dangerous place. If the world is a dangerous place, that might be not a bad story.
Yes. Yeah, I think, so I must not take risks. I think we have to examine, you know what I said about you've got to look into those pinch points, those moments of difficulty and those moments of difficult emotions and stress and go, what's underneath this? Is there a story that's playing out here? And if you kind of attack it from that way, then it might be a harmful story. But, in other ways, another question is it true? We've all got to take risks sometimes. If you buy a house, it's a risk, isn't it, right? So I guess there is a degree question here, isn't there? But is it how much truth is in there? Because actually, sometimes there's not much evidence for that belief or that story that's going underneath that. What's led me to believe that this story is true? And could examine that for truth. And again, as Christians, we're called to live. We're children of light. We're called to live truthful stories. We don't want to be letting false stories play out and dictate to us how we interpret the world around us. We want to be clear that they're truthful stories that are allowing us to see things. But I guess it's only you that can probably, maybe people close to you, that can really dictate whether your particular story might be harmful rather than my perhaps pithy examples, because sometimes learning not to take risks it might be in some situations be a good story, a good story if you're in a war zone, but you know what I mean? It depends on you.
Where does narrative fit in with somebody who's got emotional unstable personality? Where their emotions 1 minute okay, 1 minute no, 1 minute yo-yoing throughout the day.
What's the question? How would you? The story behind that.
Emotional instability.
Oh, well, I don't think people with... So emotionally unstable personality disorder is a type of personality disorder where people go up in their mood and down within a given day, and it can be very distressing, that emotional turbulence. I think they might have lots of different stories playing out. Common stories there might be, I might be abandoned. I can't trust people. I can't trust myself often. But there's lots of different stories that can play out within that. And I guess whether there's the emotional instability or that personality problem or not, their stories might be unique to them, and it's up to them to kind of understand, are there stories that are playing out here, perhaps leading to some of this emotional turbulence. So the question would be very pertinent to somebody with that kind of problem. Yeah.
I found the comparison between helpful and harmful stories very helpful, but I'd forgotten what the helpful stories were. Would we be able to go back to that?
Oh.
The 3 helpful stories.
Yeah. Well, the helpful stories were it's not about success, it's about trying. I might fail, but I know I might muck up, but my family are going to help me. And what was the third one? I'm perfect, but I know nobody else is either. It's kind of reaching into the fact that we live in a broken world and we are all people who struggle. And if you can get stories that are more in that line, then you're going to be closer to the truth about where we're at. And when you get to those stories, you realise why God's story is so important for us all.
Hello, hi. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. That was great. I just have a question about emotional reasoning, something that I'm sure it's not me struggles with. Yeah, the idea of I feel it, therefore it must be true. I find that really difficult because I think in some sense it is healthy to feel the emotion and to label the emotion as to what it is. But how do you know at what point you need to go, okay, so yeah, this is what I'm feeling, that's the emotion. It's healthy to feel it. Yeah. But not always.
Yeah, absolutely. I approach that question in another way. But I think about our thoughts, right? And our thoughts are higgledy-piggledy nonsense that come in, come out. They're completely based on context. Sometimes they are the purest, most wonderful thing, some thoughts. And other thoughts are absolute nonsense. You're like, why did I even think that? Goodness me, oh, awful. There's this guy called Evagrius Ponticus who says, as a shepherd is to sheep, so man is to his thoughts. And we need to sort of care for our thoughts, not let them go into ravines, because they're stupid sheep, and thoughts can be silly, right? We've got to keep them good pasture. So that's CBT from the 4th century, guys. Okay. Although that's a historical inaccurate thing to do, but anyway. So emotions are the same. Emotions can be silly, they can be reactive. I know emotion, I get irritable when I get home from work and I've just got, what's it called? I'm just hangry. So before I open my mouth, I need to open the fridge, right? Yes, once you've examined that thought and understood where it's come from and really looked for, make sure that it's not coming from somewhere else, then you can trust that emotion. But what you don't want to do is, say I meet Richard and Richard says something and I get angry and I think, well, this is righteous anger because he's annoyed me so I can just thump him one. That's not right, because actually that anger is probably because I've been late and I've been in traffic and I've been frustrated and it's been a little bit irritating, but actually he doesn't deserve all my anger. But that's what that kind of cognitive error was kind of getting into, if that makes sense. But we can trust some emotions, but we need to always examine them for truth. And if you understand some of what Freud says, we can transfer emotions, and there's other things like projective identification where you actually start feeling what the other person is feeling. So when I'm working clinically with somebody who's depressed, I start feeling a bit depressed. When I'm working with somebody who's very anxious, I feel anxiety. When I'm working with somebody who's psychotic, I start feeling a bit paranoid. And if I was to think that's me, that's not right. So emotions are actually very communicative. They're kind of untrustworthy. And we've got to examine them before, and we look after them a bit like, shepherd is to sheep. We've got to look after our emotions as well.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm really interested in when you talked about your accident as an example of how you started to see your story differently. I'd just be interested from your experience of what causes people to change their story. Obviously, I am aware that the world is telling us stories all the time, and I'm a church minister, and I believe the Jesus story. So I'd like people to change their story. What are the triggers? Is it just suffering, or is it other things? What are the triggers that cause people to change their story? Not necessarily to a God story, but change their story. What are the triggers?
Again, their point, why do people come to the narrative therapy clinic? Because things have got broken, things get stuck, things get, difficult. I think when people realise that they're struggling for meaning, You know, what's all this about? Why am I doing this job and living here with these people? What does it all mean? Things don't mean anything to me anymore. And that's when people start going on quests and start thinking, what is this all about? But for most of us, it's that sort of sense of, I think, distress, frustration, that stress that I was talking about at the beginning. You know, I'm really stressed about my housing. I'm really stressed about my relationship or my loved one that's dying. Well, you know, what does this mean? And I think there's less and less. I think we're in this sort of culture where we anaesthetize ourselves with Netflix and we entertain our way through the world. I say amuse ourselves. What does amuse mean? It means to not think. To amuse means think, right? So we amuse ourselves all the way through life and we don't actually think. And actually, if there's one thing that bothers me as a psychiatrist, is that you get these wonderfully rich conversations with these very broken people, these depressed people who's really in depths of despair, and then they kind of go back to their life, and then I kind of bring them back to that conversation. I go, no, I try and bring them back to the conversation, and they're not interested in it. No, I'm back here doing this. I say, well, you were asking these questions. Where are those questions now? And we kind of have this artificial quasi-spiritual bubble when bad things happen, where we use spiritual language and talk about, well, there's probably something happening thereafter. But then it goes back to just not thinking about it. And I think we've got to kind of really, if there's one thing that I want to remember my suffering, remember my pain of my arm, as masochistic as that seems, it's actually good for me to hold on to that, to stop me creeping back into actually banal amusement.
People change their stories in community. So when you're in a community where a different story is plausible,
that's absolutely right.
That makes you question your story.
Brilliant. I mean, I think change.
That's what church does, doesn't it? It's a plausibility community, where a different story might become plausible to someone.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the sad things, again, in my practice as a psychiatrist, is you see people struggling to find a story, and you want them to find a community to challenge their stories.
Yeah.
You know, because and the community is the most wonderful place to do that. Yeah. And the church, a fantastic place to do that.
There was a question over here.
Okay, I'm going to try and formulate it as best as I can. One of the lies you mentioned was that people believe that they are what they do.
Yeah.
But you said that you find meaning by how you treat other people. And a lot of the examples that you gave was how people actually move in the world. And if we listen to Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, it's an active way of moving in the world. Now, I'm not sure I can get a question from this exactly, but I'm just wondering, when does it become a lie, and when does it actually become a method of providing meaning?
Yes, I guess that's a Henry Nouwen quote, wasn't it? And I guess he was speaking to the, I'm a doctor, so is that what I am? And I guess, even in the existential sense, if you're thinking, I am up here, well, you're doing the thinking and you're doing the feeling, so is that what you do? I mean, you could take do is too much of a big word, isn't it? I would say that it's for me, it's not about what I'm doing in relationship, it's how I'm being. It's how am I expressing me in an othering way. So how am I being me for the other? So that's what is meaningful to me. So when I look at the other person and I say, how can I be Daniel best? Not to change me, but how can I be, the best of what I am for this person? And I guess so who I am is how I am in relationships. the way that's wonderful, the reason that's a really solid way of looking at your identity is because it's tangible. You can see it. You can even ask about it. You might say, tell me, how is this relationship going? What do you think of me? What do you guys think of me? It's quite tangible. It's quite in the world. It's you've got an ability to do something about it. You know, back in the days of being an external identity, if you were working class minor, you were just a working class minor. There's nothing you could do about it. If you see your identity in a relational sense, you've got something to do about it every day. And you can be everything for the people you meet. So it's actually a really freeing, exciting way to see your identity. And it's actually, when we die, it's the thing that's left. The CVs get chucked away, but the memories stay. And I think, that's kind of what you do versus the how you are in relationship. And that's an utterly Christian way of looking at it, because how do we know Jesus? It's what he has done for us in our relationship. And that's how we know him. And that's what he asks of us, to go and be the same for others. And so there's this sense of, meaning in engaging and including yourself in this big God story.
Do you think that there's a societal shift towards identity becoming more focused on experiences?
Very good question, Melindy. Well, I would if you want to read an excellent book, I've got to remember what it's called now, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. That'll answer that question. But essentially, we are in a stage where we are losing ties with families. We're losing ties with community. We are ever more changing in our careers. They aren't set. We are becoming increasingly able to give ourselves good experience after good experience after good experience. So it becomes ever easier just to see yourself as somebody who is looking to ever more have good experiences. And we get given this, marketing has the lies that they give us about what we will find meaningful in life, that I get drawn into and spat out all the time, and buy a new kitchen gadget. I think, yes, I think there's ever more opportunity, and I think what was really humbling actually about going to Kenya this summer was the opportunity for good experiences wasn't there. Like, I've got this richness and wealth of just choosing whatever I want on my smart TV and choosing whatever I want to eat. These people don't have this choice, and actually they have to look for meaning elsewhere. They're not given that luxury and perhaps that curse of being told that this is your meaning, to just feel grey, which actually we all know can't be maintained. And we're always on this, there's a search for ever more good experience that can't be quenched.
Daniel, thank you so much for approaching this whole question of meaning from the idea of story. I think it's really helped us to examine our own stories, to think what our own stories are. You've pointed us to the greater story, the gospel story of Jesus Christ, which has been wonderful. And you've also helped us to think about what happens when our stories are dysfunctional and difficult to deal with in a really practical and a very honest way by sharing your own stories. So we're really, really grateful. Thank you. Sessions once a term, so our next one is going to be in February, and we're really, really fortunate to have secured another doctor, actually, John Wyatt. He's a retired doctor, and his speciality is actually beginning of life care, so particularly caring for neonatal infants. but he's also done a lot of thinking about the whole very difficult issue of euthanasia and assisted dying. This is a massive issue in our society today. It's very likely that in the span of this current government, there is going to be a vote on assisted dying. So it's really, really important that we think about this carefully, and John Wyatt is a great person to do that. So do put that date in your diary, the 26th of February, and do think about bringing friends, because this is an issue for the whole of our society. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's been really great to have you with us.